Hi everybody, it's Courtney. Today I am going to be using the No Peeking stamp set by Honeybee Stamps to recreate or get inspiration from my own cards. So here is one that I made, I believe it was 2 years ago, and I loved the color combination. Here is another one that I also made about 2 years ago. And again, it's kind of just a masked out area of the card panel. Same thing for this one that I made last year. I'm creating a little bit of a scene within kind of a shaped ink blended area on the panel. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be making 3 cards. And for this first one, I am taking a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is already cut down to an A2 size. I pre-cut my panels just to make my life a little bit easier. And for this one, we're keeping it nice and simple. I am taking some Post-it note tape. I'm taking 4 pieces and I am just lining that up on all 4 sides of my card panel to kind of just create my little rectangle in the center that will be my ink blended little present. But before we do the ink blending, we have to do the stamping. So I'm going to use my Mini Misty here, and I am going to stamp front to back like I always do. And so I'm going to start off with the bow, because the bow would be the thing that's kind of up front and center. So I wasn't sure if I wanted to make a landscape card or a portrait. I ended up sticking with the portrait like I had originally planned. And I am going to go ahead and stamp this out with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. And I stamped it twice. Obviously, this is the first time I'm using this stamp set. I literally got this delivered to me in the mail probably about 3 minutes before I started this video. So I've been waiting on this order for a very long time. It got lost. It ended up across the country. It was a mess. But I also stamped that onto some Simon Says stamp masking paper, and I went ahead and masked out my bow. Now I can take the ribbon, and there's different bows in here. There's different ribbons that you can choose from, and I am going to stamp this vertically, and I'm also going to stamp it horizontally. Now it didn't, because I'm using my Mini Misty, it didn't exactly fit horizontally, so that didn't work out well for me. So I ended up popping this onto an acrylic block and just stamping it that way. And once again, I also stamped this onto some masking paper and masked those areas out. Now, before I actually show you the ink blending, we're going to get all of our stamping and masking done for all 3 cards first. So moving on to card number 2, we're going to work with a different shape this time. This time I'm going to be using a die cut. So I have a piece of masking paper here, and this is just a little bit larger than my card panel itself, just to make my life a little easier. I'm going to go ahead and run that through my Gemini with a circle die, and this is where I'll show you in the 3rd card, but I tried to line it up thinking I was going to be able to see through the masking paper. Not so much. You can see that I have a big gap there on the top. So I'm going to mask that off with some Post-it note tape just so that my ink blending doesn't go beyond it. Now, I'm not going to repeatedly show you all of the stamping and masking because even though I used different images within the stamp set, it pretty much remained the same. The only difference for this one as well as the 3rd one is I'm going to add this little tag that comes in the stamp set, and this obviously will also be masked out, but then I just stamped them, masked them, and then I stamped out the little ribbon, again just doing that vertically as well as horizontally. So once that one was done, we'll move on to the 3rd one, and this time I wanted to show you guys a card using or a masked out area using a stitched die, because I know that's what most people have in their stash. So this is I think it's called double stitched polygon die. This is also by Honeybee Stamps, and I'm going to run that through my Gemini. Same thing, using a piece of masking paper that's a little bit larger than my card panel, but this time I'm going to line this up a little bit differently, which is what I should have done the first time. Is I'm going to lay my masking paper down sticky side up and then lay my card panel directly on top of it. That way I have a little bit more control and I can line it up a little bit easier. Then once again, I'm going to go ahead and do my stamping just using different images. And like I said before, I also included the little tag on this one as well. Now, I did mask out my ribbons, but you'll see once we do the ink blending how to get around that, because you will see the stitched area once I do the ink blending. So now that all my stamping is done, we'll start with the ink blending, and I'm going to start with the first one, or the first card that we started with. And this is going to be the one that I use, that color combination that I really liked, like that blue and goldish color. So I'm going to do my ink blending with some blue Distress Oxides. I am going to be using Mermaid Lagoon, Faded Jeans, and Chipped Sapphire. I'm using a Blending Buddy brush by Trinity Stamps, and I am going to put the lightest color in the center. So the Mermaid Lagoon is going to go on the center. Then I am going in with the Faded Jeans. There's not a huge area to work with, so I'm kind of just going in with a light hand to get my paper saturated. And then when I go in with the Chipped Sapphire, I'm just going to bring that around the edges. So basically I'm starting where my Post-it note tape is and just working onto the card panel just a little bit. Then I can go back to that Faded Jeans, get that Chipped Sapphire to kind of blend out a little bit, and then once again finish off with the Mermaid Lagoon to add just a little bit of brightness in the center. So I'm going to put this aside. Distress Oxides take a little bit of time to dry. And moving on to the second card, I'm going to be using some greens for this. I started out with Mowed Lawn, and I think that was Bundled Sage, but I'll link it below. And just because these were the two that were closest to me. And they blend well together, but this is kind of a large area. It's much larger than the first card, and I felt like there just wasn't enough contrast. Not that there really has to be any to begin with, but I ended up bringing in Lucky Clover, and I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the Chipped Sapphire. I'm going to start on my mask and just bring that in just a little bit around the edge of this circle. Then I can go back to that Mowed Lawn, blend that out a little bit, and then finish off with the Bundled Sage in the center. I'm going to say it's Bundled Sage because I'm almost positive it is, but like I said, I will link it below. So next for the third card, I'm using Festive Berries and Candied Apple because these are the only two reds that I have. And once I started doing my ink blending, I realized how similar they were. You can see I kind of tested it off on my scrap piece of paper there, because I really wasn't sure which was lighter and which was darker. I think the Candied Apple is a little bit more true red, where the Festive Berries, I guess it has kind of like a little bit of a pink tone to it. So I did my ink blending the same way, just kind of concentrated the outer edges with the Candied Apple and the Festive Berries more towards the center. But remember, the die that we used to mask off this area was a stitched die. And these stitched lines are part of our mask, so you're going to be able to see the stitching. The ink blending is going to go through the stitching. But I have these masks where my ribbons are, and I need to somewhat remove them just to add a little bit of ink so that my little stitched line continues all the way around. Now you want to make sure that you're not lifting up this mask too much. You'll see once I remove all the masks that I did on just one area, lift it up just a little bit too much, and I have a little bit of that ink that kind of bled through, but it's no big deal. We're going to color directly over it, but you just kind of want to make sure that your stitched line or stitched outline is seamless. It goes around the entire area. So I didn't let these dry all the way, which I should have. I usually give it about 15-20 minutes to dry before removing my masks. I didn't. The first one I had no problem with. The Post-it note tape came right off. I didn't have any problem with the masking paper. And I typically use the tip of my scissors or something sharp to kind of get it started. If the mask starts to rip, let it rip, because if you try to save the mask, you might sacrifice your paper. For this second one, this is where I knew that my ink was just a little bit too damp to remove the masks. I didn't have too much of a problem for the images themselves, removing those, but when I removed the main mask, I guess you could say, the circle mask, that is where it started to tear my paper. Now you want to make sure that when you're removing a mask this large, you're kind of removing it slow. I have this sped up, but you're kind of folding it over on against the paper as you're removing it, if that makes sense. But you can see I ripped it anyway. And you would have thought that I would have learned and let this panel dry for a few minutes, but I didn't. I went right in and removed the masks anyway, knowing that the ink was a little bit too wet. But luckily for this one, I didn't have any problem at all. My paper stayed intact. So we're going to color these images with Copic markers, and I'm not going to show you all of the coloring, but I am going to show you a little bit of all of the coloring just so that you guys can see the color combinations I used. We're going to start off with this first one here, and this is the one that I wanted, kind of like the blue and gold. So I'm going to start off with my gold combination, and I'm starting off with my lightest color just to map out my darkest areas and also to get my paper saturated. For the bow, where it's kind of bunched in the center, that's going to be a little bit darker. So where the ribbon is actually bunched to make the bow. Also, for these little loops that are on the bottom, you can see the inside of the ribbon. So that area is naturally going to be darker because it's kind of inside of something. So just kind of take a ribbon and just fold it and see where the darkest areas are. Most of the images that we color, you could probably find something similar around your house and really truly take a look at the image. Take a look at it with the light shining on it or whatever helps you determine what areas would be darker. So I went in with my darkest color to kind of go over those areas. I am using some flicking motions just to kind of add some texture to the ribbon. Then I went in with the two midtones, and I will finish off with the lightest color that we started with, that Y23. When I do go in with the Y23, I am going to start on the edges of each little section of the bow and work my way down. Because remember, and I know I say this all the time, but hopefully, in case you haven't seen my videos before, the lighter the color, the more it's going to act as a colorless blender. So if you go over dark areas with your lightest color, it's just going to move around that color. It's not going to blend it. It's going to move it, and you don't want that to happen. So for the ribbon, I'm just going to work on a center light source here, and every other stripe is going to be gold and every other stripe is going to be blue. So I'm just kind of mapping out which stripes are going to be gold, and I'm just going to put one line of the darkest color on either side. I'm literally just doing one single line. As I get towards the bottom, I'm just kind of imagining that it keeps going, and I'll fix up any messy lines that we have at the end. So I'm going to use the same colors that I used for the bow itself, just leaving a center highlight for that Y23. Now for these remaining stripes, I wanted to bring in a little bit darker of a blue than my background just so that it stands out, but I am going to do it the same way. I'm going to kind of keep my shading the same way, and I'm just going to do that one line on either side and work my way towards the middle. And I'm going to be using some B90 markers. The B90 markers blend very nicely, so I don't have a problem with them blending. This is a super tiny area, so honestly, it doesn't really matter if you get the perfect blend because it's so small. I did not go in with my lightest color for this because I didn't want to risk my colors bleeding. I've already done a lot of coloring. I have my ink blended background, and the more you saturate the paper, the more likely it is for your colors to bleed outside the lines, and I wanted to definitely avoid that. So I went ahead and finished coloring the ribbons the same way as I did for this one, and we will move on to the second card. For this one, I'm going to be using some reds and greens, but my greens are pretty bright, so I want to kind of keep consistent with that. I'm going to color the polka dots with greens. Now, this gets a little bit confusing because I want to keep a center light source. So the polka dots on the outer edge of the ribbon are going to be a little bit darker. I'm not adding the darkest green to the center polka dots, only to the outer edge. So if that makes any sense, just because you want to keep your light source consistent. Now for the rest of the ribbon, I am going to use a red combination, and again, just keeping a center light source. So I'm pretty much just doing a straight line. Just being careful not to go directly over my little polka dots, and I'm going to work my way towards the center. Once again, I am using the darkest color first. There's not a whole lot of area to work with when you take into consideration that you have to go around these little dots. And also, once again, I want to avoid any bleeding. Reds are infamous for bleeding, and I'm definitely trying to avoid that. Now I colored the rest of the ribbons the same way, and I also used this same red combination to color the bow. The bow is a different shape than the first one, but the same rules apply as far as where it's bunched together, where one part is behind another. You guys know the deal. Now for the little tag, I want this to appear white, but remember any white object still has shadows to it. So I'm going to bring in a couple of C markers and just add a little bit of shading to one side, but I am going to fade this off to white. So you always want to leave a lot of white space in any object that you are coloring white, but just add a few little shadows. So finally, we will move on to the third card, and this one is going to be reds and greens too, but I'm going to go much darker, and I'm going to do my shading a little bit different. Instead of keeping a center light source, I'm not really going to worry about any light source. I'm going to add my shading from the middle out. So that would naturally be a little bit darker anyway, because that bow would be casting a shadow. And like I said, I'm just going to be using a darker combination for both the reds and the greens. So I started off with that darkest color just for the outline or this border of the ribbon. Again, very, very tiny area, so you want to make sure that you're not oversaturating the paper. You can see off to the right hand side, that's where I have that little ink smudge where I lifted up my mask a little bit too much, but that is okay. We will cover that up. So moving on to the red combination, I'm going to do the shading the same exact way. The darkest area is coming out from the center. And I'm using some flicking motions here because, like I said, I'm not going in saturating the paper first with that lightest color. And I want to make sure that my colors blend nicely. So just adding a little bit of that flicking motion will allow your colors to blend a little bit easier. So I'm going to work out to my lightest color. And once I get there, you'll see that that little smudge at that edge right there will totally be covered up. If you look really closely, you can see it, but honestly, this card is a little bit wonky anyway. You can see that bow is definitely not in the center. But like I always say, handmade, it doesn't necessarily mean perfection, but to your recipient, it will be. So I went ahead and colored the ribbon with the dark greens, and this is where I forgot to press record. So for this one, I cut it down with the large stitched rectangle die, layered that onto some kind of like a goldish cardstock, then a blue cardstock, and then onto my card panel, or card base rather. I'm going to add, first I fixed up these edges with a white gel pen just to make sure I have those really crisp edges where my ink blending ends. And then I'm going to add some shimmer with a Spectrum Noir shimmer pen all over the bow and all over the ribbon. And of course, if you guys know me, you guys know that I love, love, love my glossy accents. It adds texture and it adds a whole lot of shine. And when you add it over a shimmer pen, whether it be this shimmer pen or any shimmer pen that you have, you can see the shimmer through once it dries. Now, when you add the glossy accents, when it's still wet, it looks a little bit cloudy, and that's normal. But once it does dry, it will become crystal clear and you'll be able to see all of your coloring underneath it as well as that shimmer. It does take a little bit of time to dry though. I would give it a couple of hours at least to be completely dry. You could probably touch it within an hour or so, but you want to be very careful. So moving on to the second card, this is our circle card here where I tore my paper. So I ended up trimming this down into a square. I kind of played around with it a little bit, which I didn't show you on camera, but the square was too big to fit on an A2 size card and still look halfway decent. So I ultimately decided to create a square card. So I ended up die cutting a square from green cardstock, and I used just a stitched square die. And I also have another piece. Wow, I totally forgot what I did. I stamped my sentiment inside that tag, took an EK Success journaling pen just to add a little bit of a ribbon there. And now I'll do all my die cutting and layering. So you can see that I have my die cut piece off to the side, and I also have a piece of white, and this is just a little bit larger than the panel. I'm just adding a little bit of that festive berries around the edges to make it look as if I'm using red cardstock, but I honestly didn't have any red cardstock that matched it too well. It was much too dark, so this will work fine. So now I can layer everything together. I'm going to layer my panel down onto that fake red cardstock, and then onto my stitched square die, and then onto my card base. My card base is, I believe it's 6 by 6. I cut it to. I ended up trimming it down a little bit because I felt like it had just a little bit too much white space to it. But so in the final photos, it will be a little bit different. Added a little bit of shimmer just to the bow itself. And then I took back out those glossy accents. And this time, instead of covering up the entire thing, I went ahead and just added the glossy accents to the little polka dots that are part of the ribbon. Now for the final card, we are also going to cut this down with a stitched rectangle die just because I wanted to keep that stitching a little bit consistent. I stuck this down with some Post-it note tape just to make sure it doesn't shift around when going through my die cutting machine, especially being I want everything to sort of kind of being lined up, especially being my bow is definitely not. And then I took a piece of green cardstock left over from the previous card and cut that just a little bit larger than my card panel. Went ahead and of course stamped out my sentiment on the tag, and once again added that little bit of a ribbon with a EK Success journaling pen. Layered everything together and added just a little bit of shimmer to the bow as well as the ribbon. And that is it. That is the 3 cards for today. They are super simple and actually a lot of fun to make, kind of experimenting with different masks that you can create. So today I am collaborating with Michelle, who is also recreating one of her older cards, or at least getting inspiration from one of her older cards. And I will link her channel below. Go ahead and check her out, give her a thumbs up, and make sure that you subscribe. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.